Pockets of resistance. One of those pockets is down in Texas. Many people in Texas have an overwhelming concern for freedom, and certainly the Lone Star State as a republic had a very, very strong opportunity to resist federal authority. But one of the people that was involved with negotiations with these last few groups was Lew Wallace from Indiana. Lew Wallace was a Zouave. Zouaves had the bright red pants that you might have seen yesterday. Or if you get an opportunity, the gentleman that the fountain is named after, Captain Sparks, that's right, the Sparks Fountain here at the Cascades was named after one of the great Zouaves. Lew Wallace also was a Zouave. Lew Wallace was involved with the trial of the people that conspired against Abraham Lincoln, and he was also on the board that tried Mr. Wirtz, who was the commandant of Andersonville. We're now going to go down to Texas, where an uneasy peace remains between Union and Confederate forces. The Confederate forces are under a Colonel Rip Taylor, known as Rip because of the initials R.I.P., rest in peace, for the many, many people that he put under as not only a fighter for freedom and Texas independence, but in the Mexican War and as a Texas Ranger. Those of you that know the story of Lonesome Dove, quite a bit of that, according to Larry McMurtry, was based on one of the lives of Texas Rangers such as Rip Taylor. Ford. Report. Yeah.
Those of you that have a program, if you don't have a program, they are available for $1. The program has a little description of the Battle of Palmetto Ranch, or Palmito Ranch. And if you've read over that, let me give you a little additional background information. There was a garrison of federal troops on a little barrier island called Brazos, Santiago, just off the coast of Texas, near the opening of the Rio Grande. And there were 3 units that were stationed there, the 62nd and the 87th United States Colored Troops, and the 2nd Texas Cavalry U.S. Another regiment was sent to join them, and that was the 34th Indiana. So those regiments were stationed in this little garrison of Brazos, Santiago. And let me share something about the 62nd UST. They initially were the 1st Missouri Colored Infantry. They were formed in December of 1863, and they trained at Benton Barracks in St. Louis. They were issued new British Enfield rifles, .577 rifles, a very fine weapon. In the spring of 1864, the 1st Missouri Colored Infantry was sent to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where they were federalized into U.S. government service, and their designation became the 62nd United States Colored Troops, USTs. They were then given duty along the Mississippi River and down into the Louisiana Bayou. It was on that operation that over 350 men would die of disease and were buried deep south in the Louisiana soil. When the opportunity came for them to be transferred, they were elated. They were going to be sent down to Brazos, Santiago, down on the Rio Grande in Texas. The unit was described as well drilled and disciplined, and they were definitely fit for field duty. Their commander, their overall commander for this event today for the Union soldiers, was Colonel Theodore Barrett. He was in his 20s. He was born in New York, spent most of his life out in Missouri. He did suffer from bouts of typhoid fever, and he had had very limited military and combat experience. During today's engagement, it was Lieutenant Colonel David Branson, 24 years old, who would be the commander of the 62nd USCT. When the 62nd arrived at Brazos, Santiago, They described the place as most undesirable. There were plenty of flies, mosquitoes, and sandburrs. We had our regimental headquarters at this place, which was knee-deep in salt water. And believe me, these boys were interested and anxious not only to see a little action before the end of the war, but also to see the war come to an end so that they might go back home to their families. The 34th Indiana would also participate very heavily in this engagement today. They were commanded by 25-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Robert Morrison. Morrison was battle-hardened, as was the 34th. They were organized in Anderson, Indiana in September 1861. Their battle record is pretty amazing. They fought at Kentucky. They were at Island Number 10. They fought in Arkansas at Grand Prairie, and they were very heavily engaged in the Vicksburg campaign, fighting at Port Gibson, where they captured a section, which would be 2 cannons, of Virginia Confederate artillery. They also captured 50 prisoners there. They were heavily involved at Champions Hill in Mississippi as well, still part of the Vicksburg campaign. They captured there the flag of the 46th Alabama and about 125 soldiers from the 46th Alabama. Following that campaign and the surrender of Vicksburg to General Grant, the 34th Indiana did a year of service down in the Louisiana bayous. They weren't happy about it. Disease racked their ranks as well. And they too were very anxious to be sent to another location, and they were, in January of 1865, sent to Brazos, Santiago. In the battle today of Palmetto Ranch, the 34th Indiana would lose more soldiers than they had in all the other engagements of the war. They were not a spit and polish unit. They were very veteran and serious, especially serious on the battlefield. And they were considered a crack combat unit. In this engagement today, 2 companies, which were used as skirmishers, would be sacrificed, Company B and Company E. As well, in Company B was a private named John Jefferson Williams. He was a member of Company B. He was a blacksmith by trade. He was married as a teenager. In this battle, he would become the last Union soldier killed in the Civil War. A Minnie ball hit him in his right temple, blew out his brains, instantly killed him. But Private John Jefferson Williams, the last in a long, long line, a long, long list of casualties, which numbers somewhere close to 700,000 American men, North and South, who died in this fratricidal war, the American Civil War, or the war between the states. There was another unit, incidentally, that was stationed out on that island at that garrison. They were the 2nd Texas Cavalry U.S. They were U.S., and the Texans, the Southern Texans, looked upon them as traitors. They were the infidels who had sacrificed not only the Confederacy, but also their love of the state of Texas. At least that's the perception of those Confederate Texans. The 2nd Texas was comprised of a lot of Hispanic troopers. In fact, there were 443 Mexicans who fought in the 2nd Texas U.S. Those soldiers carried and wore wide-brimmed sombreros, not the kepi that we think of as being standard issue to the Federals. Of the 500 men in that unit, they were comprised of Germans, Irish, French, Italians, Prussians, Spanish, Cubans, Nicaraguans, and even a few Canadians. So that's the component of the Union forces that are going to be involved at Palmetto Ranch. There would be about 800 men on the field. The skirmishing had been going on for several days when the final engagement would commence. The Confederates, as has been mentioned to you, were commanded by Colonel John, quote, "Rip, rest in peace, Ford." He had 300 Texas cavalrymen. But they had something else that was interesting. They had 6 artillery pieces, and a 7th artillery piece would actually be engaged, but not commanded nor utilized by the Texans. They were French. They came over from the Mexican side, crossed the Rio Grande River, and actually set up and were engaged in this battle. French soldiers, imperial soldiers, would be engaged in this last little battle. We are now ready to see the Battle of Palmetto Ranch recreated before your very eyes. The final battle, the final action of America's Civil War. We see this federal artillery open fire. You can see that black powder smoke as it wafts through the air, with the wind blowing it back to the north. This battle was fought along the Brownsville Road, which fairly much parallels the flow of the Rio Grande. This is scrub, desert, cacti infested areas, lots of sand, lots of rocks, a few outcroppings, but not a lot of chaparral in this area. Confederate cavalry, almost exclusively in this battle. Some Confederate artillery and Confederate cavalry. Cavalry skirmishing under a Lieutenant Jones, a Confederate cavalryman, had occurred for several days as Jones continued to fall back toward the west, toward the Confederate base. The Federals continued to pursue under Colonel Barrett, his 62nd USCT in the lead, the 34th Indiana pursuing or following, 2nd Cavalry, 2nd Texas Cavalry US, mostly dismounted, but also engaged in this action.
Okay.
Off in the distance, you hear the battle. And that's the 62nd United States Colored Infantry moving in our direction. They should be emerging from the woods soon. You may recall that during the war, African American units were commanded and led by white officers. Often those white officers had served as enlisted men or non-commissioned officers, and sometimes junior officers as a 2nd lieutenant or a 1st lieutenant in other regiments, and then they had opportunities to move up in rank and position, and often the opportunities were to lead the USCTs. So in this case, the colonel and the lieutenant colonel who command the 62nd USCT are 2 officers, Caucasian young men. Okay, we see federal troops moving out onto the flanks. They've just come through that gap. They are pushing the Confederates back, trying to push them back. Okay, we see the 62nd USCT, more of them moving out onto the field, and they're driving the Confederates back. Remember, these were well-drilled and well-disciplined soldiers. These were very, very well-disciplined troops, having received their training at Benton Barracks up in St. Louis, on the north side of St. Louis. Lots of troops, even Michigan men went through that area. Some more artillery supporting. You can see those boys in blue over there. And you see the Confederates emerging through that gap in the trees to the west side of this field. We have skirmish lines out there, the Union skirmish lines, trying to slow those Confederates down. Remember, Robert E. Lee had surrendered his army 5 weeks before this engagement. But the word has not gotten out here to Texas yet, or if it has, the fight is still on. Oh, I see more Confederates moving up. These were reinforcements. This is Colonel Rip Ford, who is bringing his troops over from Brownsville. It looks as though they're going to hit these Union soldiers in the flank. In fact, we see those Union soldiers immediately starting to pull back. Remember, they have these infield muskets, these rifled muskets. Those rifled muskets used on both sides, the .577 caliber infield, is deadly accurate at 200 and 300 yards. It has a killing range all the way up to 900 yards. That's obviously a lucky shot. They can fire 2 to 3 minutes, 2 to 3 mini balls per minute. See them falling back, and we see the Confederate skirmishers moving now, taking aim at the Union boys. Artillery still firing away. There's a little volley from maybe a squad of Confederates off to the south, to the southwest. But we hear reinforcements coming up. You hear those drums coming from the other side of our field here. We're looking for these battle-hardened Indiana boys, the 34th Indiana. Let's see what they do.